Hey there, Rob. Happy New
Hey,
Year.
Happy New Year.
How you doing?
Good. How's it going?
Yeah, not so bad. Is it just the two of us today?
I think Yakov is going to join. I'll I'll ping him.
Separately, if we could push this meeting back half an hour, it conflicts for me with the conference committee. Um, that would be really helpful just going forwards.
Maybe I'll shorten it to a half hour and start at I'll make it just the second 30 minutes of the current time block.
Okay. Yeah, that works.
While I have you here, the errors path spec update. I think I have all of your suggestions incorporated now.
Oh,
So
great. Yeah, I wasn't 100% on all of them, to be honest. But again, it's partly reflecting the underlying text inconsistent use of terminology. Every time I make edits, I'm always trying to make it more consistent.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, definitely. Yeah, I was just a little hesitant about putting like a link to like we don't have a definition for a
Error
request
result.
error
Yeah. It
or error result.
all it will do at the moment is it will just make it italic, which is
Yeah.
fine.
Okay.
And then if we later define error result, which we should in the text above, then it will just automatically become hyperlinked. So I think that's fine.
Yeah, I was playing around with defining it, but I think you might want to like rewrite it a little bit, and I didn't want to get too many more changes
In the same
on
pull
top of this.
request,
Yeah.
yeah. That's my general push is to minimize the number of changes in an individual pull request. It's easier to get it merged that way. Yeah, I think it looks good. I'll whilst we wait for Yakov, I'll just have another quick read of it now, and then I can put a +1 on it, hopefully.
Okay, and then I'll bring it up and see if there's any objections to merging at the February meeting.
Yeah, and because it's editorial, it doesn't have to go through the RFC process. So just a couple of TSC +1 should be sufficient, or a broad enough working group approval.
Great.
Hi.
Hey, Yakov.
Hey,
Happy New Year.
Same.
all right. So, wanted to talk about the issue that Yakov brought up last week. I made a discussion topic on it. I was thinking originally like we could add validation to basically we have validation now inside the overlapping fields can merge whatever it's called rule, and that looks for the same field in a given selection set that has either stream with different arguments or a mix. One has stream, one doesn't have stream, and it rejects those. What it does not do is if there's a stream inside of a defer and a stream that's not inside of a defer, or a stream that's in two different defers on the same field without aliases, it doesn't do anything for that. I was thinking that we could expand that rule to do that. I think it might be tricky because it has like a visitor on selection sets and it's not actually traversing the whole tree downwards where we could, if you have a defer that's a few fields up higher, like we have in the example, I don't think we have like an easy way to get that context passed down to where we need it. Um, so I guess like there could be a few options, like we could throw a field error. We could say that this is allowed and figure out behavior, how it should work. We could write a new rule that does do that whole traversal. Yeah, I just want to get everyone's thoughts.
So when I was thinking about validating against this, I was thinking of making sure that all the selection sets on the different streams were identical, not that we would disallow like two streams on two different defers, but that we would allow it as long as the selection sets were identical. I don't know if that makes it easier or not.
We should definitely not do that. And the reason is actually quite well expressed by Marc Andre's recent post, the moist post, as it were. But essentially, it doesn't allow for the later expansion. If these things are coming from different components and they're currently allowed because they happen to align, and then one of the components updates their fragment and adds another field to it, it's suddenly breaking because you've added a field to a fragment somewhere, like doesn't necessarily make sense, especially if it's just a field like name, for example. If it's something that you've added the stream directive to, then it's a bit special. And so it failing because it clashes with it not having it somewhere or having different arguments somewhere else is more reasonable. But like just being able to add name and not being able to because your other component on the other side of your application hasn't requested it is less desirable. So yeah, I would just either allow it entirely or disallow it entirely and not worry about whether the selection sets match or not.
Is that different than, in general, if we have an alias that is to one field in one side of the application and then an alias, same alias by accident to a different field that they would clash? Is it particularly worse here?
I would say it's particularly worse here because you can break it by just adding name. When you're adding something that's aliased, like you are doing something that's a bit more special. So the chances of having a conflict are higher. When you're adding arguments to something, the chances of having a conflict are higher. But if you are literally just referencing a simple field, you would generally expect that to just work.
And the conflict could be like several layers higher up than where you're adding the field.
But you're right, it's not perfect. And like Relay would help take care of this for you by like naming your fragments sensibly for you so that it's all fine. I think, I'm not sure. Maybe Relay would break in this situation as well, actually. Don't know.
Do you mean in the situation where we have
How would we get into so the query that you have in the discussion issue 100, how would we get into a situation with Relay where a query like this was generated? And if we did, would the nested friend list have been, or the nested object have been aliased? by relay?
I don't think it would. I think that you could, with relay, have one component that's the top half of the query in a fragment, and then another component that is the second nested object, and then a third component inside of that, which is the defer with the nested friend list inside of it. And so you have two components where they're not aware of each other's stream. The second component with the stream might not even be aware that it's inside of a defer. And that's where you have the conflict now. And
Yeah.
so like the original like proposal that Yakov was saying was, well, what we're doing now isn't ideal because that first component that's not deferred, that has the stream in it, is now dependent on the timing of name, which isn't something that it's asking for. And splitting them up also isn't ideal because what I had originally said, I was saying like that name should come in later and that would block the other defer, but that's not right either because this like explicitly said like we shouldn't be waiting for name because it's inside of a stream. So I'm not sure of like what if there's like a good way to handle it that will make everyone happy like in every scenario.
So the way that
So-
I would have interpreted it with the original plan for this is that essentially stream is very much like defer, except it's on each individual list item. So I would have seen it as effectively the ID coming in and then as a deferred name for each individual item in that streamed list. But that is quite noisy and probably not very efficient.
What I'm worried about that is how are clients going to interpret that result because there isn't a defer. We're not going to have like a pending for a defer somewhere that's like only for this name inside of the list. So I don't know how you would know like when you have all the fields that you need on the client.
Okay, so I apply the same rule to this for all of the things, which is basically Matt Mahoney's trick, which is to use, for example, an alias type name. So I'm gonna write it as a comment on that thread. So just give me a second whilst I put that in there. Part one.
I did think we were trying to get away with that with our pending and completed notifications.
No, not that's not my intent for them, and I also don't think that it fulfills that need at all. The point of the pending and completed is to know when it's safe to no, I'm not going to say anything more on that without me carefully thinking about it again. But essentially, if you were to tag each of these things, and you have to remember that anything that is deferred or streamed, because stream is effectively a defer anyway, will need to have a tag inside of it anyway. So here I've added the part one, part two, and part three labels, let's call them here. Those are essentially is my fragment ready to be used. So when you get the first streamed item of the nested friend list, the part one will come along with that because it's not deferred by anything else. So it should just happen. Actually, that may not be true. The ID will come, but that will not be complete. When part one arrives, you know that you're now safe to use that entry in that left hand or that top component. The later component won't be able to use an individual item until it gets part three, which will come alongside of name. So by adding the fields into this, or these aliased fields, it tells you when you can use the relevant data. And this is a trick that works fairly well already. I think I'm trying to remember why Matt came up with this in the first place. Because he wanted like completion labels, but I can't remember the specific reasons behind it. I feel like it was before stream and defer.
Yeah, it was a separate proposal for like a fulfilled meta field to figure out if a fragment has been included, like when they're conditionally included, skipping include or some sort of but I think actually not mostly skip and include, mostly like a particular concrete representation of an abstract type. You want to know if that exists, and it's easier for like the client side tooling, I think, to just check for the existence of that like sort of label.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, like you say, the skip and include is a good use for that, or a polymorphic type. Those were the use cases I couldn't think of because I'm in a stream and defer mindset right now. Yes, exactly. But that's that exact same pattern that you would use for the skip and include or for the polymorphism that exact same pattern should still work for stream and defer, however we implement it. And it would, with what I proposed, it would also with, I think, what Rob proposed, where the name would come in at the end. It just means that none of those items would be usable until the very end. And it would also work with what you proposed originally, Yakov, which I think was effectively merging the selection sets together. All of those would all pass this criteria, which is, for me, if it failed this criteria, then I would just chuck that result out as like, this isn't consistent. But all of them pass it. So we can still choose between them on other grounds.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I don't think that it should be a requirement that you have to use this to interpret the results, because I think that the pending and completed should be able to give you enough data to do that.
So the pending and completed, if you use them for this, they just say something is pending in this selection set, which no, because we can give things labels, can't we? So you can use the labels. That's what you're thinking. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so this is currently not allowed. If we put, let's say, the same query, but we had different labels on the stream, that is currently not allowed by the validation rule. But maybe it should be, and then you could get a pending for each stream, and you could send one stream result back that could fulfill both of them.
So this harkens back to another. Sorry, Yakov, you go on.
I think the problem there, if I understand you right, is deduplication. If there's sort of an overlap between them, then we sort of have to figure out a way, cool, nifty way, like we did with defer, to sort of like break up the different, overlapping pieces. Sorry about that. Sorry to.
Oh no, not at all. Yeah, so you're right. That is absolutely it. This also harkens back to another topic that was raised, or that I raised on your latest RFC draft that you wanted feedback on, Rob. And that was the behavior of initial count. So to my mind, initial count means give me at least this many upfront. So if you had initial count 2, I would not expect to receive an empty array unless there are no items there. If we treat it in that way, then skipping the stream would be perfectly safe because you will give the full collection. And also merging multiple streams directives that have different values, like initial count 2 and initial count 4, would be perfectly fine as well, because you would just resolve it to the larger of them. You would give 4 results, and that would satisfy the initial count 2, but it would also satisfy the initial count 4. In that, if we were to do that, then we could also allow the labels, and that way, once 2 have arrived, you can now output the label for that one, whereas you wouldn't output the label for the other one until you get 4. Again, I'd have to actually look at the network payloads to see if that actually made sense, but yeah, something along those lines.
Yeah, I don't think the response format though gives us a way of sending like, because we say items and you have an array of items. I don't know, like, yeah, like, is there a way? I don't think there's a way to say like, here's the item with ID and part 1, and then later on here's the ID, here's the item with part 3 and name.
Yeah, you'd end up with,
Yeah.
you'd get the 4 results up front, which satisfies both, and then every additional item from then onwards would relate to both labels. If you had 2 stream directives, I mean.
I mean, I'm sorry, I'm doing this on mobile, but I mean, we could do, send like initial, so I can't like type out the example, but we could, for 2 different streams, one with like ID and one as a field and one with name, we could send, empty objects with either ID, and then an empty object with, sorry, not an empty object, and then the whole list with all the IDs, with the ID for that stream. And then when the next one was ready, then we could send the empty object with name. Just if we were doing that, we would have to add index to the so I think to sort of keep things straight, because they might not actually be the same number of indices. I don't know how I would implement that, but I think that would sort of fulfill the criteria. It just wouldn't be a simple algorithm anymore, especially as we could be streaming instead of objects, so we could be streaming lists of objects, or even technically lists of lists of lists of objects, etc.
If we forget stream for a moment and we nest, and again, I haven't looked at this in detail for a little while now, so, and as you know, this is quite complex stuff. If we had nested defers, the parent defer would complete before whilst a child defer is still ongoing, right? Or is that not the case?
Yeah.
Okay, so to my mind, a stream is also a defer, essentially. You can think of it as like having an automatic defer in the selection set or something like that, if you want to imagine it in that way. So I would say that the name that is returned here is like almost separated from the defer that's in the parent selection. Like the stream separates it out into its own separate thing. So effectively, what we are really talking about is the merging of streamed selection sets, whether or not the parent is deferred. The field collection for this would result in the nested friend list not being deferred. So the fact that there is a defer there is irrelevant for the selection set on the nested friend list.
But if you're the person that wrote the component that just has the first half of the query with no defers, and that name field is really slow, is that a problem for you?
I think it might be, but I also don't think that it is triggered specifically by there being a defer there. I think the exact same issue would happen if we were to delete that defer. It doesn't matter that the lower component has a defer there for the fact that this name might be a slow field. If it didn't have that defer there, we would still have the exact same issue, right? That the name is going to slow down the top component.
Right. But I think that by putting that defer there, you think that you're not going to adversely affect any non-deferred part of the query.
I see what you're saying. Now I'm wondering again whether that would be the same if you were just using defers and you forgot streams.
If you were just using defers and you forgot streams, then name would come in. Name would still be deferred. And that defer wouldn't be completed until you got all of the names.
I think there's an analogous situation though. Gosh, it'd be nice if these were faster to type out. So I've submitted another comment to that thread, and I'd have to again remind myself exactly how this stuff is working. But what I'm essentially saying is that I think I see, and I've not really seen it like this before, like explicitly. But I see stream itself as like inherently the selection set of a stream inherently being deferred. So it's as if you put another defer directive inside of it. So I think what we would have in this situation would be a little bit like what I've put in that second comment. And in this situation, the root defer in the second nested object doesn't actually make any difference whether it's there or not.
I think the difference with this is that by having that second defer under nested friends list is that we'll have a pending for it. And when the response format comes in, it's incremental with the data that we're putting onto existing objects. So that
Yes.
Yeah.
I agree. And what I'm saying is, I think that is the way that it should be. Whether or not there is a defer in that root selection set, I think it should always behave like that anyway. Because a streamed thing is deferred. It is said, resolve this later. And if you say resolve this later, but just give me the ID, versus you say resolve this later and give me the ID and this really big field, it shouldn't matter that you said also defer the fetching of this via a stream. Like that's not the important part here. The important part is in one case you've asked for an ID on this deferred thing, and in the other case you've asked for the ID and some expensive field. So I don't think that, in my opinion, that root level defer shouldn't matter. What should matter is that essentially streamed selection sets should be treated as if they have a defer around them anyway. And if it happens that there is only one selection set, then we can ignore it because we can optimize it away. But if there's multiple places where that's been referenced, then the fact of them being deferred is more significant.
I think this relates a little bit to some comments that I probably didn't explain too well in the chat. I'm not sure that I agree. Meaning for defer we have a tree, and presumably we can assume like the sort of the component hierarchy in that tree basically tells us the priority of the different defers. Whereas with stream or even any really sibling defers, we don't really have any knowledge of the priority of those stream. All we know is that the initial count items should be returned initially, but we don't know how quickly or slowly really the application would like those items. So we don't have any knowledge, and it could be that the defer does mean that the whole stream should be delayed, but it could be not. Now, I'm not sure if that's sort of like the same thing that you're saying. We don't have any knowledge, and therefore we have to ignore it. I mean, maybe it is, but it's sort of like a different way of looking at it, I guess.
One way to think of it is this: a streamed item is already deferred. You return an async iterable, and then when you get a value on that async iterator, once you receive that value, you then resolve it by calling those selection sets. If you were to put a defer around that and there was only one selection set, the effect would still be exactly the same in terms of like when the data gets executed, because there's nothing else that it's waiting on. So it would just immediately kick off the execution of it. It still does it like at a later time.
Okay. I think that are you saying that you're in favor of what GraphQL.js is doing now, which is you get each streamed item with both ID and name on it?
The duplicated form?
No, where the two streams are, the selection set of both streams are combined into one, and you get one streamed result back, and the selection set of each item in the stream is the combined result of its ID and name. Am I explaining that?
I understand what you're saying.
Okay.
That isn't the one that I was discussing, but also I'm not necessarily in favor of any of them right now. I'm
Okay.
just trying to figure
Yeah.
out what they are. That one is straightforward, but it would be like us merging two defers that are at the same level,
Yeah.
which to me is, we've said we won't do that for defer, so why would we do it for
Yeah.
stream? So I think more what I'm saying is, it's like any time that you have a stream, a selection set on a stream item, you can imagine that there's an invisible ... at defer around it. So then, yes, you can merge those selection sets, but those selection sets would be merged with their ... defers around them. And that, I think, would still give you like consistent data. It would be potentially noisier, and we may want to, like, I'd have to sit down and work my way through the payloads, but we might want to like optimize that first. If there is only one deferred selection set at the end, then we just skip the fact that it's got a defer and just carry on from there, sort of thing. But that's an optimization that we're allowed to do, that because we're allowed to ignore any defer anyway. So we don't actually even need to write that into the algorithm. But yeah, I'm essentially saying there's an invisible defer.
Which would also mean appending and complete for each item in the list.
Yes, if you were to honor it, yes.
I want to make sure, I don't want to interrupt anyone's flow, but I do want, someone mentioned relay earlier. And my question is, in terms of relay, from what I understood, what relay does is it uses basically the arguments as the alias, and sort of can therefore get to more efficient queries by like combining certain things. So that's my understanding. So my understanding would be that if we validate
I think what you're thinking of is that it uses the arguments as the cache key in the store.
Okay.
I don't think it necessarily would rewrite a query like this, but when the results came back, because they have the same arguments, they would go into the same object in the store.
Okay, because that would be important to make sure, because otherwise we run into this validation error even if someone tried to work around it with a different alias. So yeah, so great. Okay, I hope not. Okay, I'm gonna put in the chat. I found a computer. I'm gonna put in the chat, I think, what if we don't validate against this, like what a different stream sort of merging output would look like. First, I'm gonna try. It might take me a while. Or maybe I'll put it on the discussion, actually.
So Benji, I think that that proposal that you said could work. The downside is that it's pretty, feels heavy. Like it's a lot of stuff, just a lot of stuff for something that I'm not sure how often you would actually run into this in the real world.
Hard agree. So as I mentioned before, as an optimization, you can basically say skip that defer if there is only essentially one selection set. And I think for the majority of people, there would be only one selection set. Like, I think having this streamed list in multiple places across the code base that happen in the same query is fairly unlikely. Excuse me. So I think it would be fine to write it up even with a step in the algorithm that says we recommend that if there is only one deferred selection set here, then you just skip the defer, you pretend it doesn't exist. And I think we could do that with like basically a single line in the spec text.
But still, every client has to handle the possibility that they might get these pending and completes for.
That's true anyway. Like there's nothing stopping you putting a defer selection set inside of a stream payload.
Right, but the client would know that because it has a defer. But in this case, the client has to know that when it sees a stream, it also has to look out for the deferred, the pendings from each item in the stream from the invisible defer.
Yes, okay, I see what you're saying from a code generation point of view. Yes,
Yeah.
that's correct. As I say, I kind of see stream as being a defer anyway, so that makes sense to me.
So I'm not sure if I understand the whole, I mean, but I definitely don't see stream as being a defer. I mean, in particular, like in our example, or, you know, from this example, we don't know, meaning the example from 100, we don't know whether, like, we have two calls to nested object or two selection sets under nested object. Maybe those come from two different components. And then one of them has a non-deferred nested friend list, and one of them has a deferred nested friend list. So again, those presumably come from two different components. We don't know if the non-deferred component needs that stream, you know, earlier than the deferred component needs its stream. Like, we have no knowledge of that, and so I don't think we can. I don't think we can assume that names should be sort of deferred on the items of initial count. I mean, I just don't think that we know that that's really, like, without priority levels on these incremental directives. We don't know if that's, you know, optimal, because then it means, like, let's say there are slow fields in both streams. We don't know which one, you know, we would want to wait for, which one we really want to be deferred. You know, let's say they have two different initial counts, like if we eventually support that. We just don't know any of that. And I mean, I think. And so I'm not so I really don't see it like sort of like as simple as defer. I think we get into tricky edge cases, like we're seeing here.
You're right. I hadn't factored the initial count into my thinking of this. Like I hadn't thought about initial count at all actually for this. We can't see stream as having defers inside of it if you have an initial count of 2, because explicitly your initial count is saying, give me 2 of these things. You're also right that if the second one has a defer around it, then that initial count stuff should still be deferred because it's effectively not streamed, right? But it was inside of a defer, so it should be deferred. It shouldn't hold up that first component from rendering. And Rob, I think what would make this issue more obvious is if you were to change the example to have initial count 2 for both.
Yeah.
That would make it much more explicit what some of the other subtle problems here are. And
Right.
yeah, I don't know what it should do in that case. You would have to, right. You would fetch the first 2 nested friend list items. That's what the query is saying to do. If you have an initial count of 2 and it exists outside of any defers, you would fetch those items. Then when it comes to resolving the ID, that's also not deferred, so you would do it. The name, the name is deferred. Oh God, the stream interaction with defer is really, it's only complex because of initial count, I think.
Well, I think you would have the you would have a pending for the defer, and the initial response would have nested object, 2 of the items, only with ID. You would get 2 more incremental payloads with the name of the first 2 items. That would close out the defer, and then you would get the third stream item, and that is like the same, puts us back at the same place. right? Of what
Yeah.
happens there.
Yeah, I think that's correct. What I'm trying to work out is algorithmically why and how can we make it clear that that is correct, and make it so that the name gets deferred later.
Right.
And I think that I still stand by what I said before, that the fact that the name should later be deferred should be the case whether or not that defer exists. If you request the stream twice and you have two different selection sets on it, and one of them is slow, that shouldn't make the first one slow as well, because they're separate. Like, they're separate streams, I think.
Right. It does today, because we're assuming that they can be combined because they're, yeah. If you didn't have defer and you have the same field twice, both with stream, they get collected together though. And it's essentially the same. It is the same. Let's rule out the easiest solution. Should we not allow two streams on the same field at all? Like, right now they're allowed only if they have the same arguments. Should they be forbidden even if they do have the same arguments?
I think that might be a fine initial solution for the initial delivery. I mean, I think I posted in the chat, or sorry, not in the chat, on the discussion, what I think might be one way of like doing this sort of the way we did defer. And I think you would have to add, you would sort of inevitably have to add the index also to the streams, because the two different streams might give a different number of items, I think, theoretically. But I think all of this is kind of too complex. Meaning, I think we still have a solution space, like a lot of options in terms of our solution space, and I think it would be fine to sort of just avoid this all in the initial release. The other thing, like, I would really hate to say, because of all this, we have to release defer before stream entirely, so that, I think I'm sort of in favor of that. Not as the end game, but just as the initial kind of, yeah. I mean, not in favor of it in principle, but like, if the more complexity we can sort of wall off, like, and if that's what we need to do, I'm in favor of it.
If we were to do that, if we were to forbid stream existing on the list, let's explore what that would mean. We can do that in validation. We still need to tell the system how to execute it. And when it comes to telling the system how to execute it, we can tell it to just read the first selection set, the first selection, i.e. we would see that nested friend list at the top. We would not see the nested friend list at the bottom, because the algorithm would just assume that it can't exist again because it already had stream on it. That's okay. Like, we do that, I think, for subscriptions as well. Like, there's a validation rule to say there's exactly one. In fact, we can just put an assertion in the collect fields that asserts if it has a stream directive, there must be exactly one of them. So I don't think that the execution algorithm will be particularly problematic if we add this as a validation rule. So that's fine. Now think about it from the user use case perspective. Do we think that it is likely that two different components will want to render the same list and stream them? And if so, do we think that it's likely that the initial counts would or would not match up, and that the labels would or would not match up, and that any other arguments that we add to that directive in future would or would not match up? And I think the likelihood of everything matching, but being defined in two different places seems quite low to me.
What if it's a name fragment that's referenced in two separate fragments, one of which is deferred and one isn't?
What
But
would,
then they're
can
the same
you,
selection set.
so I
So
always try and think of this in terms of like what would it look like in an application? So can you think of an application where you would want to render a streamed list in the same position in the query in multiple places on the page?
yeah,
Yes. Yes. Here you go. News website. You maybe have a ticker across the top where you render the top articles, but only the headline. And then when you go to the main articles page, you still have that, but you also have like the news articles with more content. Is that a reasonable one with like new items popping in at the top, maybe, or something like that?
yeah.
Okay, we have a use case for it. How common is that use case? Is it one that we would be happy forbidding?
Well, we wouldn't forbid it so much as like sort of teach people to use aliases and get around this problem, and maybe with some duplication.
That's it. Yeah, we'd tell them to use an alias. Is it okay to tell them they need to use an alias to do this? Is essentially the question.
So again, in the long run, I think the answer is no. Like it doesn't feel right. It feels like we couldn't solve it. We're admitting it. I think the long run, I think we could have some good long run solutions. And I think we have the space for it. So my idea would be like, meaning I don't think if we forbid it now, it sort of constrains the solution space later. So I think, it sort of depends on how complete we want the feature to be at initial rollout. Maybe that's kind of like a PR kind of question.
So I'm looking at the guiding principles of the GraphQL spec right now. And we have simplicity and consistency over expressiveness and terseness. It says possible but awkward is often favored over more complex alternatives. So yeah, it's possible to have this list twice, but it's awkward because you need to use an alias for the second incarnation of it. Maybe better if it keeps the simplicity of the solution, if it keeps the complexity lower. And I think that we could solve this via treating each of the streams as if they've got like a defer inside of it, but only when it's the not initial count version of them. But I think that that's complex. And I think avoiding it would be acceptable. And if the trade-off there is that people need to use aliases in the rare circumstance like that news ticker website that I said about just now, I think that's probably an acceptable trade-off. If that's what we want to do, I suggest that we take that decision to a wider audience and see if we can get general sign-off on forbidding this specific use case. Basically saying it's too complex. There's like 4 different solutions. None of them are great. They all have trade-offs. Should we just ban it outright? At least for now. We can then solve it in a later spec version if we really want to.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I just want to say the two hesitations I have with the validation rule, they're not strong hesitations, but the first one is just that we've had the rule that did allow multiple streams on the same field with the same arguments on the GraphQL JS Alpha 17 for quite a while. So yeah, it's experimental, and this would be a breaking change to restrict more of it. Would also be a pretty quick way, I guess, to see who is actually relying on that. The other thing is like, if this did turn out to be super important, and we want to solve it, and the way of solving it was saying like, you have to imagine that there's a defer on every one of the streamed items, then that I think would also be breaking for clients that have no reason to assume that right now.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not too concerned about those things. Like, this is an experimental feature. The whole point of having something like this is so that we can change what it is so that it ends up being the right thing. Once it's in the spec, that's it. It's there for, the next 10
Yeah,
years,
yeah.
the next 20 years. But now is an acceptable time to change it. Ideally, people who are using this stuff are using it for experiments and aren't really necessarily shipping it to production. I know that that's not the case, and people are shipping these experimental things to production. So ideally, we won't break them unless we have a really good reason. But also, I think this is a really good reason. This is an edge case. So hopefully, no one's hit this problem anyway, in which case, doesn't matter. If they have hit this problem, then there's all sorts of potential issues that they may face in the future that come out of it, like when they add that slow field later and it makes their other side of the app slower. So I think saying that we've spotted this issue and we're preventing it with a validation rule. And if this is important to you, then come to the working group and help us solve it, I think is perfectly reasonable. I would recommend that in this validation rule, certainly in the experimental version, not once it goes live, we add a hint in there that essentially says, in the January 2025 meeting, we resolved that this would no longer be supported. If you're hitting this error, we want to hear from you. Please comment on this issue.
Yeah. Just to clarify, this rule would have to ban stream on the same field. Just make sure I was talking about stream on the same field, both of them no defers anywhere in the query. I could like that you wouldn't be running into the issue that we're talking about where one is slowing down the other because they're collected into the same field, but that's what it's kind of blocking. It's preventing like more use cases than just this one edge case, I think. Still, I still think that it's probably fine, but just making that clear.
So I've just sent a really short query to
Yeah,
the chat, which doesn't use any defers. But essentially, if you have list and you stream it and it's got a fast selection set, and then you have list and you stream it again and it's got a fast and a slow selection set, then I think this exhibits this problem anyway. And so yes, we're forbidding that.
Okay, great. Current behavior right now is one stream with both fast and slow. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so that's what we've currently done, but I think we should just forbid it.
All right, so I'll write something up in this discussion. I'll make a PR in GraphQL.js. I'll probably link to the discussion in the error message if I can. And I think, and then we could talk about it at the main working group February.
Sounds good. On the other topic, the one I raised a little bit earlier about the initial count, are we agreed that the initial count is a minimum, or is that like just a hint essentially? And where did that decision come from?
I'm pretty sure that I brought it up a long time ago, and I think that I was arguing in favor of what you had said, but the pushback I got was that for clients, it shouldn't really matter because the types that are generated have to support any kind of list of any number anyway. And I didn't feel that strongly about it. So that's where we ended up. This was probably like in the very you know, the very early days of, you know, only the first 1 or 2 years of working on this. But
Okay.
it might be worth discussing again.
I think it probably is. I'm just trying to think, would one of the behaviors be a safe default and then we change to the other one? And the answer is no. If we start by allowing you to say initial count 2, but deliver 0 and then stream the rest, then that means all clients have to expect that their initial count might be ignored. And it might all be supplied in follow-up payloads. But similarly, if we were to dictate in the spec that it is a minimum now, that's not something we could lift later, because clients would now expect that to be honored, and removing that restriction would break potential client assumptions as well. So I think this isn't one of those ones where we can be strict one way or the other and then soften it up later. I think we have to decide one way or the other up
I
front.
think the thought was that the option that we have now would allow you to move in the other direction, but not vice versa.
I'm not sure that it would. It would, hang on. So if you say, give me the first 2, but we get zeros, it would force the client code to handle the 0 case, which
Yeah.
means that your clients would have to be written in such a way as if that was always the case, because they don't know what the server. Well, yeah, okay. I suppose if you know that your server implements a newer version of the spec that now implements the new constraint, you could then update your client logic. Yeah, the spec only tends to care about breaking the client, not the server. So if a client was written to an older spec, it would be happy receiving 0. And if it received 2, it would still be happy. Yeah, okay. So yeah, the current one is probably the least breaking of them. I'll need to think about that a bit more. Nonetheless, I think it should be a minimum. I think it makes sense as a minimum. And if it is a minimum, then though from a type generation point of view, it might not make much odds. From a user application point of view, it may well make a big difference. For example, knowing that you are either going to render 0, 1, 2, or many comments under a feed item in the feed it tells you whether or not you need to like render a placeholder and stuff, which you can get other ways. Like you can look at the pending items and decide whether to render a spinner based on that. But I think in many cases, people are going to prefer to just use the data that is resolved and not worry about using the pendings to know whether there's stuff still coming.
Well, you have to look at the pending and completed to know if the list is complete or not, or if the full thing was delivered without any more later.
Yeah.
But sorry, I really have to
Yeah, you have to
jump
go.
off
Sure.
now. But yeah, thanks a lot, everyone.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thanks.